You probably think that your thoughts are yours. After all, they are in one sense the most personal and private thing you've got. No one else has direct access to your thoughts but you. So you have a sense of ownership, even control over your thoughts. And yet, in another sense, our thoughts are not ours at all. Our thoughts, the ones that we take for granted in our everyday thinking, are a product of layers of history and culture overlaid on top of our human nature. If someone was born into a human body with the same kind of brain that you have 20,000 years ago, they would be incapable of thinking the kinds of thoughts that you are thinking. Even somebody 1,000 years ago when this temple behind me was built wouldn't be able to think those thoughts. The thoughts that you think that are yours are in part yours and in part a product of the extent to which your mind has been colonized. Decolonizing your mind requires deconstructing very basic ideas that you think every day. For instance, you probably think that you have a relationship, or that you've had relationships, or that you're looking for a relationship. Relationship is a concept that you take for granted. But even a few generations back, relationships didn't exist. No one had a relationship. People were married, and that meant something very specific depending on what part of the world you were in. But no one had this vague sort of relationship thing that we have. But when you think you have a relationship, that is actually based on some ideas about gender roles and division of labor and the sexism that accompanies them, about ownership of one person by another, and a kind of exclusivity around the relationship and the family structure that keeps that in place. Now, are those really your thoughts about relationship, or are they thoughts that you were conditioned with? And do they produce, as a result, things like jealousy and possessiveness and infidelity and codependence? Do you want to think about relationships that way? If you deconstruct this culturally based concept, is it possible that relationships could occur in ways that are more fluid, more multidimensional, that you could have many different kinds of relationships that interweave intimacy and sexuality or commitment and family in ways that you have not yet conceived of? To find out requires that you deconstruct a basic concept that you may think of as your own thought. Another example of this is, do you have a life? Do you think that you've got a life? You know, people say things to each other like, how's your life going? Or people get all upset and wonder, what am I going to do with my life? This whole notion that you have a life is not really a foregone conclusion. It's a particular curious way of constructing your experience of the world and of historical events from your life and projected future events and assembling them into a particular package called a life. But this package comes from a historical context in which your life is based on what it is that you do for a living. That's why we call it that. Your job, your role in society that allows you to participate in a social structure that has a particular hierarchy and a particular structure of power in which we need people to take on different jobs and to identify with those jobs. So your relationship with your job and to some extent your family is what determines your experience of your life that you think you have. But are those really your thoughts? Is that how you really want to think about life? Or did those get somehow implanted and conditioned? And do they produce things like a sense of competitiveness with other people who you're always looking around at to see, are you doing better than them or not as well as them? Or does it produce a kind of lack of self-worth that comes when people are constantly seeing whether or not they've met certain developmental milestones that you think you should have met by now, but perhaps you haven't? Is it possible that life could be something that's more dynamic, that's more unpredictable, that's more subtle than all of that, that's an ongoing thing that's happening that may not be a function of your past at all? These things that we think we know, in fact, knowledge itself is another example of this. You know, do you really know things? What's true? What's fact? And what's your basis for believing what you think of as true or fact? I mean, that comes from a cultural context too, where certain kinds of facts are handed down by scripture and must be taken on faith. Or maybe you believe that fact and truth is only determined by people who use something called the scientific method, which allows them to determine what's true. Or maybe you've got a kind of postmodern relativistic notion that there is no real truth. It just depends on your cultural standpoint. Are those your thoughts, or are they thoughts that were given to you, that leave you with a way of thinking about knowing that's kind of rigid, that kind of keeps you stuck in old ideas instead of constantly able to stay creative and flexible and able to have a mind that's open and able to do extraordinary things? The joys of decolonizing your mind are the joys of deconstructing every little thought that you have, so that basic notions like love and sex and relationship and family or career and money and life are all things that are up for grabs. Everything can be questioned. And in the process of questioning those, you can end up with relationships that are more fluid, that are more multidimensional, with a quality of an experience of life that's more dynamic and more subtle, with ways of knowing that are more flexible and more creative. So if you're not somebody who already appreciates the great joys of deconstruction, please take them on with me. If you decolonize your mind and find out how to evolve and think the kinds of thoughts that you weren't already given, so much more is possible, and it's much more fun.